I agree with you. Well, 2 hours is 2 hours.
Yeah. She will put it in your face, like
either way.
Yeah, like
be less than
a lot of them do.
Are they all excited?
Yeah. I highly
Everybody down here is like,
I have one.
yeah, I can't. I really like
You're right. You're right.
I actually went ultimately like I hired renowned parents. I mean, yeah, normal-ish. I mean, it's nice to have more freedom.
Are they here now or are they still there?
Good. Challenging. One of our account managers just quit. So I have been able to do my job without
Sounds like my
Yes. Area. They couldn't
Okay, guys, can we get ready to start? Awkward silence. Be quiet.
Yeah. Silence.
Okay. So this is Anthony, and he has very kindly driven all the way down from Jacksonville today to talk to us. He is going to talk to us about his Clouded Leopard project, and so I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Lauren. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight, and it's my pleasure and my privilege to be here to talk to you folks at Big Cat Rescue. For those of you that don't know, Big Cat Rescue has supported species a few times in the past, and so I'm very excited to be able to share with you some of the newest things that we're doing in our organization. I'm going to talk to you about a species that I'm very passionate about, the clouded leopard. It's not a coincidence that logo up on the top left there, that we chose the clouded leopard. For me, it represents in many ways all of the work that still needs to be done out there in the world. We do work very broadly on carnivores, so not just cats, but clouded leopards represent one of those species where there's still so much more work to be done, both scientifically and from a conservation perspective. So I'm going to just jump right into it. So for those of you that don't know, there are actually 2 species of clouded leopard. One that we think of as the Indo-Chinese clouded leopard, and on the left it's the picture on the top. And in the map it is the green coloration, so you can see they range from Nepal to the west, east all the way through China, south through the Indo-Malay Peninsula into Peninsula Malaysia. And then about I want to say around 2006 to 2007, genetic testing was able to show that the animals that occur in Borneo and Sumatra, that we traditionally thought of as maybe just a different subspecies or race of clouded leopard, are in fact a different species. So there's 2 species of clouded leopards, and there's more work to be done in looking at comparisons between Borneo and Sumatra and some other areas. So it's very possible that the final book on the clouded leopard and how many there are and how many subspecies there are hasn't yet been written. And I included this quote because I'm a zoological history nerd. I like picking up those old dusty books and going through them and seeing what people were thinking in the 1800s, the early 1900s, maybe even the 1700s. And it was very interesting at the time because the mainland or Indo-Chinese clouded leopard was somewhat known, at least at that point. but there was some discussion back and forth as to, what about this other cat? It kind of looks like that one. And so this was almost like the start of that discovery of the Sunda clouded leopard and the differentiation between that and the mainland clouded leopard. And that was actually some dialogue involving the founder of Singapore, Sir Thomas Raffles, in 1822. So I like to start out by saying, okay, so what? What about the clouded leopard, right? And when we talk today, we generally acknowledge, and this is always changing, maybe there's about 40 or so cat species in the world. And when I say it's changing, sometimes a new species actually pops up, but more often we determine that species that we thought were one are actually more than one. So maybe two, meaning they look similar, but genetically they're actually different, just like what we did with the example that I just used with clouded leopards. And so I like to say, well, what titles do the clouded leopard hold, right? We know what probably the largest cat is. You guys could probably name the fastest cat. Also happens to be the fastest animal in the world, right? It's not the most powerful cat. And so I make an argument, however, that it's probably the most unique of all the cats. And I'm going to take you on a little journey here to make my argument, so to speak, as to like why I think clouded leopards are so unique. So I like to include this chart all the time because all the way to the right is the clouded leopard in terms of scale. It's not a leopard. It's actually the smallest of the true big cats. And so when we say big cats, when an evolutionary biologist says big cats, and not necessarily when you guys say big cat, we're talking about pantherines, basically. Tigers, lions, jaguars, leopards, snow leopards. And of course, snow leopards are also not a leopard. They just include leopard in the name. And so, interestingly there, do you guys have servals on? Okay. So you can just see basically how a serval kind of towers over this clouded leopard. A big male might be 50 pounds and stand about 16 inches at the shoulder, so not very high, shorter than a German Shepherd. And of course, like a lot of other cats, strong sexual dimorphism where males are maybe about twice the weight or size of the female. So think of the female being even smaller, right? And so the word Neofelis, as you might imagine, translates into new cat. But there's an interesting relationship between the pantherines that we just talked about and Neofelis. The clouded leopards are the only non-Panthera pantherine cat. So that sounds really confusing, right? So Panthera is just the 5 big cats that we were just talking about. And the only other genus that completes what we call the subfamily, so when we're talking about pantherine cats, we're kind of talking about this subfamily, so to speak, are clouded leopards. And in reality, instead of being the new cat, clouded leopards are probably the oldest lineage of cats. And in reality, they diverged from these other pantherine felids about 11 million years ago. Now, when we say 11 million years ago, it's plus or minus 3-4 million years, and it's usually based on our knowledge of genetic mutations through time. So we're basically kind of looking at what's called a molecular clock, and we're estimating as to when that divergence more or less happened. I like this picture because it shows a lot of the cool things that I really like about clouded leopards. For example, they have the longest tail proportionally of any cat. And if you know or surmise anything about clouded leopards, you've probably heard maybe they like to spend some time in trees. Well, a really long tail obviously helps with that. What also helps is having a low center of gravity. So you saw the diagram of how the clouded leopard relates size-wise to some of these other species. Well, part of that is actually so that they can stay pretty grounded. I mean, they still more or less outweigh that average serval, but they're lower, and so that lower sense of gravity really helps them kind of move and track limbs as they move through branches and trees. They've got enormous paws for their size, and I've seen them up close. I've got had the privilege of spending time with a breeding consortium and some very nice folks in Thailand, and got more than my fill of clouded leopards, and got to see them up close, and got to hold those paws in my hand and splay them out. And I am amazed that a cat that size has feet larger than a mountain lion's. Think about that. Think about that. The average mountain lion, but still incredibly big. This aerodynamic build, which probably is second only to the cheetah, and this photo on the top left is a National Geographic photo. I can't take credit for that, but what I like about it is it shows that sort of leanness and that aerodynamic. And again, right, that's going to help you as you're moving about, and I'll talk about how that relates to some other adaptations in a second. In particular, how it relates to things like leaping or jumping. And so I would always argue that among all cats in terms of their jumping ability, the clouded leopards, the smallest of the big cats, holds that title. But I always like to include this slide that there's one cat that might actually disagree. This show off right here. And ironically, this cat, which we often refer to as a big cat, is the world's biggest small cat, right? So, and if the clouded leopard has any challenger, it might be a mountain lion, although they don't nearly spend that time in the trees. But here are some things mountain lions can't do. They can come down a tree head first, like a squirrel. There's one or two other cats that can do that. A margay, a small cat, and a clouded leopard's cousin called a marbled cat. Here are some other things clouded leopards can do. They can walk upside down. And what I like about the photo on the top left is look how thin that branch is. And this is from that facility that I was talking to you about, where they have these wonderful enclosures that are just full of natural trees, and these clouded leopards just can run around and play. It's just pretty fantastic, and you get to actually watch them and learn about them in a way that you would never be able to in a wild. So it's really interesting putting someone like me, like a carnivore evolutionary biologist, in the cage with these animals. It's like my head feels like sometimes it's going to explode. I have all of these ideas like, wow, these animals are incredible. And how about this one? They can hang from their feet, basically using their tail as an anchor. And look at those paws splayed right there. Look at that webbing. Could you imagine if you were a quietly sleeping primate in the trees on the branch below? So I said, okay, probably the most agile cat in terms of these adaptations that we're talking about. I'm not sure if there's a lot of agile cats out there, but I would give the prize to clouded leopards. Here's a fun fact. What if I told you clouded leopard teeth on some males were actually as long as that of a tiger? Now, we know how big tigers are, and I just told you how small clouded leopards are. That's pretty impressive. So all of these adaptations, these big feet, these big teeth, what if clouded leopards were actually the size of a tiger? What would the implications of that be? So, you laugh, but there have been 5 evolutionary iterations, let's just say, independent. The saber-tooth we tend to think of as like, oh, this one animal. Some people know it's called the Smilodon, the saber-toothed tiger. They know it's not a real tiger, etc. But there were actually 5 different evolutions of what we generally refer to as saber-toothed cats over the last 20 million years. I've often wondered, could the clouded leopard lineage be number 6? The shape and the design of those canines in the top right there are very consistent with a lot of these iterations. And just to drive this point home a little bit, I'm going to show you this slide. One of these skulls belongs to an early saber-tooth, Paramacroides, that lived approximately 9 to 15 million years ago. And the other skull belongs to the clouded leopard. Now, if you recall, after what I just said, Paramacroides lived right around the time I was telling you a few slides back that Neofelis diverged from these other pantherines 11 million years ago, right? Interesting. Also, Paramacroides has adaptations in its limb morphology which suggest that it also spends a lot of time in trees, climbing, and being arboreal. So if you haven't figured it out, that's your clouded leopard. And those similarities are pretty striking. So that's my argument in many ways for why I think clouded leopards are really unique, and it's certainly many of these things are among all of the things that I'm really passionate about for them. Clouded leopards face a lot of challenges on the landscape. Many of the things that threaten clouded leopards threaten other species of cats, but also threaten entire ecosystems. You may be familiar with this one. This is a big problem where we work. We work as part of our program, which I'll talk about in a little bit. 3 of the top oil palm producing countries are clouded leopard range countries, and they're countries where we have some projects now, and you can see what oil palm does to the landscape, and you could also see that it's almost unavoidable. It is in everything. There are a lot of really interesting initiatives, including the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. I'm certainly supportive of that idea. The idea that palm oil would be planted in areas that are already developed, but just transformed for palm oil, leading to net zero deforestation beyond what has already been lost, is a positive thing. The problem is that, and I like to use the Florida example of a grocery store. If I go into Publix, for example, and I'm looking for something to eat, and I flip over and I'm reading ingredients, sometimes palm oil is hidden. Sometimes, if I'm lucky, it says palm kernel oil, right? You've all seen that. Sometimes it just says vegetable oils, and it doesn't elaborate as to whether it's palm oil or sunflower oil. But very rarely does it actually say sustainable. So how do I know what I'm buying? This is a problem. So right now in my household, we have a zero palm oil. We have a zero palm oil household. And if I can see sustainable palm oil, I will and acknowledge it for being sustainable, I will try to go out of my way to buy it and support it. But it needs to be labeled better than it is currently. This is a big one in very recent years, and this is going to be a big threat we're going to have to continue to deal with in the future. You guys probably heard last year that the Amazon was on fire. Another place that I work just south of the Amazon is called the Gran Chaco. It was also on fire. In between the Chaco and the Amazon is another ecosystem called the Pantanal. It was on fire. Those are places where I do work with jaguars, for example. And over the years, Southeast Asia has been on fire in some very important clouded leopard habitats across Borneo, across Sumatra, also on mainland Asia as well. And in particular, there's a very interesting forest type called the peatland swamp forest. It's rare, it's pretty unique, it's fairly well restricted to places like Borneo and Sumatra, but compared to other forest types, it's a lot rarer. And it has it's having an increased tendency to burn. One of the problems, of course, is deforestation and how it leads to greater susceptibility to burning. Also, agriculture, which tries to clear out crops and along forest edges or areas that have been cleared, that is also an issue. This is a very endangered forest type, and it's also relevant and home to a few other species that I'm going to talk about in a little later, so I'll circle back. This slide breaks my heart in a lot of ways. We know about tigers, trade in tiger parts, trade in snow leopard parts and skins. They receive a lot of attention. There are entire agencies dedicated to monitoring them, but I've read lots of these reports. And what I started to notice was I would often see in the photos that accompanied these reports on trade in tiger skins, there were basically clouded leopard skins hanging up in the background in those photos. and yet they weren't mentioned anywhere. And it started getting me wondering if they were being undercounted and underreported. So this is something that we're trying to focus on a little bit more. Also compared to a snow leopard skin, which, let's say if a snow leopard skin went for $400 to $500 US and a tiger skin went for $1,000 US, you might be able to get a clouded leopard skin for $50 or $100. So it's relatively cheap. And how many people here have heard of CITES? Right, which basically restricts the movement of materials across international boundaries. Well, some of the data that we're gathering suggests that maybe the skins aren't even crossing the boundaries. Maybe they're also being consumed locally, and that could be leading to underreporting. And so why would you have it? Why would you have a skin? Status. You're basically kind of advertising that you've got the money, the disposable income to be able to have that skin. And so this is something that needs a lot more attention. And so our one of our program activities right now is addressing this, and I'll circle back to that a little bit later as well. And they're happening across the range of clouded leopards: Thailand, Borneo, Myanmar, Vietnam. So it's not restricted to just one area. Also, as you might imagine, just for like other carnivores, for tigers, for snow leopards, the loss of prey species, potential prey species, which I'll also circle back to as to why potential. Right here, actually. Look at how variable clouded leopards are. And I have in here a mix of the different species. And you can kind of see for comparison how they sort out. For example, in the top right-hand corner is a Sunda clouded leopard that you might find, for example, on Borneo. On the bottom right-hand corner is an Indo-Chinese clouded leopard. You can almost kind of see the differences. You can see how for Sunda clouded leopards, for example, the spots are a lot more defined and cleaner and separated from one another. Very interesting, but also, of course, quite variable. On the bottom left is a different, I believe this is an Indo-Chinese clouded leopard from one of our sites in Nepal, which take on a different coloration from those that you might find in more tropical lowland forests, for example. So what do we really know about clouded leopards? Well, that's the problem. As I said at the outset, this is a species that requires, I think, a lot more attention, a lot more investment. That's something that we're trying to spearhead right now. This is our program that we've started, is the only one dedicated to them. And so we're trying to answer even basic questions like, what do they prey on? I showed you some pictures of some potential prey species, but there are no good empirical studies suggesting, no good scientific studies that have actually looked at what clouded leopards eat. They're very difficult to study. It's very difficult to find clouded leopard scats in the forest, for example. We know they've got these adaptations for spending time in the trees, but how much time do they spend in the trees? And why? And where? And when? How does that vary across the different sites that they live? We just don't know. These are some questions we're starting to try to answer, as well as their social behavior. One interesting, a colleague of mine actually recorded an interesting behavior of clouded leopards basically marking two clouded leopards that appeared to be adult, basically marking one right after the other in the same spot. But that's just kind of like a tantalizing piece of information. Like, what's going on there, right? What was that all about? And when you see that video, you're just kind of, in many ways, left with more questions than you had before you saw it. So, clouded leopards, because of their size, they're not the tough carnivore, the tough predator on the block. They have to live with leopards. They sometimes have to live with tigers. They have to live with sun bears and Asiatic black bears, two other species that we work with. How do the presence of these other carnivores impact clouded leopards? Do the presence of those species impact them directly? Does it relate to how much time they spend in trees? Meaning, if tigers are present, are clouded leopards just mostly staying off the ground? I'm thinking I would, if I were one. What about even the basics? Home ranges, territories? There's some information. We're even trying to answer some basic questions about their distribution. And so what does all of this really mean? Well, this is kind of where Project Neofelis came from. It was the first and only program dedicated entirely to protecting clouded leopards, to learning more about them, to promoting awareness about clouded leopards. And so in 2018, we started Project Neofelis on International Biodiversity Day as a way to pursue these goals and objectives. And it is our hope to be represented on the ground in every clouded leopard range country over a 7-year period. We've got maybe 5 more years to get in some of the other countries that we aren't yet. So let me talk to you about where we are and what we are doing. We're working in Nepal, where if you remember that early map that we saw for Indo-Chinese clouded leopards, this is supposed to the country that represents the current western boundary of Indo-Chinese clouded leopards. But we're finding some very interesting information. Yes, that photo on the top right is a clouded leopard walking in snow. To my knowledge, this is the only one. We have a few others, but these were taken in north-central Nepal. When we think of Nepal, and traditionally when I've thought of Nepal years ago, I think of snow leopards, I think of tigers, I think of a red panda, I think of lots of species before I think of clouded leopards. But these forest types here are in those same mountainous ecosystems that further up also have snow leopards. It's just that over the years, nobody's really looked. And so I have a good friend and partner who's actually working in this region, and we're hoping to support him to do more work here. Meanwhile, all the way to the left, where that red star is, in a place called Kaptid National Park, is where we stumbled upon a report that clouded leopards are actually there. And this would be about 250 kilometers outside their known range. The habitat there is very different. We were there and we said, what could clouded leopards possibly be doing here? And so we had to verify with the head ranger there, who basically had worked all around Nepal and clarified for us that he knew clouded leopards well, and knew the difference between clouded leopards and said, oh yeah, there's clouded leopards here. So we're very excited to start some work in Kaptid National Park. It's a very remote area. The first 2 times we tried to get there, one of the bottlenecks on the way there is just one road, and if you can't go through that road, you cannot get to the park. And 2 times, there were various mudslides, basically, where we had begun going there and found that the road was impassable, and so just had to turn around and go back. There's nobody to call, nobody to radio ahead and say, what does the road look like? You just have to go. So we think a good time for us to go might be October, November, so we're thinking about getting things set up there later this year, if all goes well. Taiwan is really interesting because Taiwan does not have clouded leopards. But once upon a time, Taiwan did have clouded leopards. And so we're very interested in the story of the clouded leopard there. A colleague of mine did a lot of work putting out cameras in remote areas in southern Taiwan, that orange area all the way to the bottom, is sometimes spelled with a T as well, Dawu mountain area, which was thought to be the last place where clouded leopards might be found. And a long time ago, he had put out some cameras there and found that everything else seemed to still be there, and that includes anything a clouded leopard might eat, but there were no clouded leopards. A lot of the other areas had been surveyed very well, and clouded leopards, the reports suggest, did not occur across the entire island, but were restricted to some protected areas in the south. And so we became very interested. This is the landscape there on the left. And so we started thinking, there's a story here. We'd like to know more about it. there are two indigenous nations in Taiwan with whom we began working, and their stories are actually tied to the clouded leopard. One group, the Rukai people, they tell the origin story of their own people and where they settled on the island, and that story is basically by following a clouded leopard. That's how they came to settle where they were. And so clouded leopards were and continue to be an important cultural component to their history, their identity. And the Paiwan people, both the Rukai and the Paiwan, they have indigenous hunting rights and have had indigenous hunting rights in Taiwan, but they're mostly looking for pigs and deer. So because they manage this area in the south and because they have governance over this area, while lots of folks were talking about, is it biologically possible to bring clouded leopards back, we thought, well, that's not a question for now. The question for now is, what would people think about it? And what would people feel about it? Would there be support for bringing back clouded leopards? And so I had the privilege and pleasure of visiting many little towns and villages like this, which are part of these Rukai and Paiwan communities there in the center, nestled kind of in these jungle hillsides. It's pretty wonderful place, and got to learn about the Rukai and the Paiwan people, and each person that I got to the privilege of talking to had to spend a little bit of time first drinking some millet wine. And so at the end of a couple of weeks, I felt like by the middle of the afternoon I had a really good buzz going as I talked to many people about clouded leopards. Because think about it, if you show up in somebody's backyard, you're just not going to start talking business. And that's kind of, in many ways, what species is and the core of our philosophy. We work very hard to build social capital with stakeholders. And we're really interested in the people too, not just the information that they have to share with us and give us. We know the people that we work with sense this, and they know this. And so we learn a lot more. And so we made some really interesting friends. And we also learned about the story about how when clouded leopards were caught by accident, no one was ever going after clouded leopards. No one was ever trying to kill clouded leopards. And the reason why they disappeared in Taiwan is not from hunting of these indigenous folks. But when it did happen, it was considered an honor to turn over the skins and the carcass to the chief. The chiefs then would keep this in the family and pass it down. And so we were able to see some of these materials, and so had this idea of we're actually starting to try to get genetic material from some of these skins to learn more about what was called the Formosan clouded leopard, which is another name for Taiwan, Formosa. And that was the subspecies that was believed to live there. And so what did we find? Well, I'm very excited that we just published this literally about 3 weeks ago. We found that there was overwhelming support. 2/3 of the indigenous folks that we interviewed were generally supportive of the idea of bringing back clouded leopards. As you might imagine, they had some concerns, as any hunting group would. What do you think a group that hunts pigs and deer was concerned about as far as bringing back clouded leopards? Any thought on that? Competition. Some of the questions that we got again and again are, there was a lot of nodding, a lot of positive nodding, and then there was, what's going to happen to the deer and the pigs? And so this was great because there was a good point of engagement with folks, and we made it clear to people that at no time is there really any evidence of a tropical felid, for example, having that much of an impact on species like this. And so we made it very clear that this would not be a concern. But we've also identified a potential concern to address through future outreach activities. So we want to get that number even higher than 2/3. And then we conducted electronic interviews, internet-based interviews with the general urban public of Taiwan. And we found that 3/4 of them basically supported, of our sample, basically supported the ideas of bringing back clouded leopards and had positive attitudes toward clouded leopards. So this was really exciting. We've got some more work to do there. And this is actually a good segue, because Thailand is important to us for a variety of reasons. We're doing field work there, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But what's happening in Thailand right now is actually relevant to what we want to do more of in Taiwan. I had the privilege, like I said before, of visiting the Clouded Leopard Consortium. This is a great, incredible, dedicated bunch of folks that get to wake up to and interact with somewhere between 50 and 55 clouded leopards every day. I mean, if I could camp out there, if I could get a free bunk there, I probably would and just give up everything else. But they know more about the reproduction of clouded leopards. This facility provides a lot of new animals to zoos across the United States. In fact, a few that I met, including this one right here. You can see how big I'm smiling there, basically. This is Yang. He's a male clouded leopard that consistently tried to bite my feet, get my feet, and stalk me when he didn't think I was looking, but I was always looking. And he's a pretty incredible animal. And I learned that as of November, he's now at the Nashville Zoo, along with the unrelated female that was in there. Getting CITES permits to move live animals across international borders is not easy. And so one of the challenges was to get them actually into a facility before they became too old to breed. But they represent new genetic bloodlines. And this is him kind of close up. He's making eye contact, but he's still thinking about my feet in this photo. And that's Bill Wood at the center. He's an incredible and dedicated person. He's kind of the guy that runs the show over there. And it's his expertise in part two that we're after. We're actually looking and hoping to bring him to Taiwan soon. The idea, having a conversation now about constructing a facility to start thinking about, at least for the foreseeable years ahead, what clouded leopards might look like in such a facility in Taiwan to get greater exposure to among the indigenous people, for example, among the forestry department. We've had meetings with them. There's a lot of interest in doing this, and so this is going to be something I think we're very committed to pursuing. And then in Thailand, we are also very excited because we're hoping to start the first long-term monitoring project of clouded leopards anywhere in a place called Klong Sang Wildlife Sanctuary in the adjacent Khao Suk National Park. Years ago, I had the privilege of starting to work in Thailand with some folks from the Wildlife Conservation Society back in the mid to late 90s. Worked in Thailand when much of the country still had tigers. And Khao Suk was one of the first national parks, unfortunately, to lose its tigers. We collected some of the first data on clouded leopards in 2017 and 2018, and it's a very rugged landscape. I'll show you some pictures. And so our Thai colleagues, we provide a lot of support to in-country scientists, and I have a good friend and colleague who's basically coordinating a lot of all of these activities, and we're trying to provide a lot of support to him, and we're about to sort of do our next round of sampling this year. So this is kind of like one of the first areas that's been sampled, that's going to be sampled again, so that we can start to map a population of clouded leopards through time. Interestingly, although there's sun bears and Asiatic black bears there, for some reason the leopards seem to have disappeared too. And although this seems like a sad story, and of course it is, we want these forests to have all of their carnivores. I certainly do. I want to see that day. But if we're going to learn about clouded leopards, and we want to understand what those populations might look like in the absence of tigers and leopards, that'll give us an insight basically into their ecology in some of these other areas. We'll have a better understanding of how tigers and leopards and other predators do impact clouded leopards in other areas. And this is what this landscape looks like. It's pretty incredible. It's part of a reservoir, and this whole area was flooded by a dam many years ago. It's incredibly beautiful. There are these limestone cliffs and this karst topography, which is actually something it has in common with Florida, of course, all that limestone. But this photo on the left is pretty typical, and you can kind of see this is not an easy habitat to move around in. I was moving around many of these areas by boat. We would be putting out cameras by boat. It's a very interesting landscape, and this was us on the wettest day when we just couldn't keep the boat in the river anymore, and we were about a day and a half from the headquarters. We just basically had to pull over and pull the boat ashore, and we just sat there and got poured on. This is my colleague Dusit in the middle, and on the left is Wyatt, a graduate student that Dusit chose to work on some of these objectives that are related to this project. So, very exciting. We're starting some work in Peninsula Malaysia, and this is a really interesting project. This is around some reserves and refuges and also some mixed-use landscapes around one of the largest national parks in Peninsula Malaysia called Taman Negara. This is probably also the home to the largest population of Malayan tigers left on Earth. In these landscapes here, this is kind of like a shot of Taman Negara from one of the high points. And we're hoping to work with the government here also on a Malayan tiger project, but that's going to be a little bit down the road. This is just to kind of give you an idea of what an old primary rainforest looks like. This is probably one of the oldest rainforests on Earth. It has existed like that as you're seeing it probably for millions of years. And so there aren't too many places like that. Unfortunately, Taman Negara has become incredibly isolated, and so that big dark green chunk in the middle there is the Taman Negara landscape, and the yellow that surrounds it are these state-owned forests, more or less. By state, I mean the Malaysian government. And then the green is some ag production. These are the areas we're really interested in, and I'll tell you why in a second. And the gray are some developed areas. And so one of the things I was really drawn to about this area was I was starting to get reports of clouded leopards walking through these mixed agricultural landscapes. And there isn't a lot of good data on that, including the top left there and the top center. How many people know what a durian fruit is? Okay. Eat it, don't smell it, right? Okay. Really good food. And so we have this relationship, and our colleagues have this relationship with this the owner of this durian orchard, and we heard reports of all of these species that live there. In the bottom left, or in the bottom center rather, you can see this limestone massif. This is not Thailand, but it looks familiar, like the photos I was just showing you, right? It's not really far from Thailand. It shows you how large this landscape is with this kind of topography that goes from Thailand down into Malaysia. And so it was very interesting. We found a whole host of critters using this durian orchard and using rubber tree plantations, including, I think, this guy. Now look at this tail. I've never had that. Most of the time, cloud leopards are very focused and very busy. It's like, boop, there they go. And if you get like 5 seconds, that's a long one. So that one was pretty exciting. So a lot more to come. This is our team, Izareen. He's probably going to be a student of mine later this year. Jayaraj, who's all the way to the left. He's a colleague of mine. He's now a species associate and scientist for Peninsula Malaysia, and he's associated with 2 universities over there. And so very excited about all the potential over there to see how these mixed we even got reports of clouded leopards and black leopards, black panthers, right, what are colloquially known as black panthers, using oil palm plantations to get through some of these other mixed-use landscapes. So if we can know a little bit more about why they use these landscapes, we might be able to develop more clouded leopard-friendly agricultural practices and more carnivore-friendly agricultural practices. So I'm very interested in where all of this is going to go. And then back to Borneo for Sunda clouded leopards. Years ago, Species and our colleagues were the first to really estimate the size of a Sunda clouded leopard population in Sabah in Borneo, which is that green state that's circled there. Those two green parts of Borneo are part of Malaysia. If you remember, we were talking before that Malaysia is the only country that really has both species because it's got the peninsula and it's got Borneo. So we've got a long history of working in Borneo. Here's a very busy map, basically, but one of the things I'd like to show you is if you can see, and this is why I grabbed it because they're numbered, and I could kind of refer to them even without a pointer. So if you can see 3 and 4 there, you've got parks known as the Crocker Range and Kinabalu National Park, and see they don't connect. You see how they're kind of like isolated? Well, we're just starting to talk to the communities that live around there who are very worried that the government's just going to take their land and connect it. And so we're trying to find ways to incentivize them. Can we develop some agriculture there that is compatible with what they want, but also compatible with carnivores and clouded leopards and sun bears? And what we'd really like to do is start a pay-for program where we jumpstart a program, for example, by giving them camera traps and telling them, all right, we're going to start giving you some funding. We're going to start giving you some money if you get pictures of clouded leopards and sun bears. And then see where it goes in terms of what that agriculture is that's going to be compatible. What other things can they do on that landscape that's compatible? Can we even help and invest in that? Because it has to be some middle ground too when working with communities. We just can't go there and draw a line around areas and tell communities they need to leave. That's just not the way it's done anymore. We need to find ways to integrate communities. And the best ways to do that are to try to find some financial benefit for them. And then we're working in and around 13. This is really interesting. Some of our early work years ago showed that actually selective logging in an area can actually benefit clouded leopards. It's not one of those threats. Notice when I talked about threats before, I never said logging. That is not something that happens. Sure, if you go in and you clear cut an area and you completely deforest an area, that's bad for everything. But if you selectively harvest timber, you might be able to actually create some better habitat for certain prey species. And we think that in some of the numbers that we were seeing, the way clouded leopards were responding, they were responding to this increase in, let's say, muntjac deer, bearded pigs, mouse deer. And so we're very interested there because of, well, here's one of the photos that we got basically, but because of this video right here. This is really what got us super excited. And this is actually my first so the staff sees them, not infrequently. So it's got us thinking, how can we partner with the managers there? People are always asking me, oh, where can we go to see a clouded leopard? And for years, I just shrug. Got lots of camera trap photos. My colleagues have lots of camera trap photos. Other people have lots of camera trap photos. But there aren't really good places. In fact, I've always said clouded leopards are the hardest, one of the hardest cats to see in the wild, by far. But we may have identified an area where we can start to host some small eco-tours, and with any luck, the revenue generated from those eco-tours can even then go and benefit this logging concession, so that they see, oh, guess what? We're doing things right, and we're going to now receive some financial benefit from that. So those are the kinds of models and some of the things that we're really after when working with communities. So we're very excited. That just really happened last year. I'm hoping to be back over there again this year to further this whole thing along. I showed you the slide earlier under threats, probably one of the more gruesome slides in my presentation. So what are we doing about that? We've developed a small internship program, which has been really interesting, and it's getting a lot of structure now. And what we're trying to do is document as much as possible this illegal trade in clouded leopards. And actually, one of the things we found, not just in terms of we were really after things like skins and parts and things, but we found there's actually a live trade in cubs and in animals in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Indonesia. So this is interesting because this wasn't on anybody's radar, and one of the things we're hoping to do very soon is provide a report to the IUCN Red List and to CITES about this, and this is going to be a preliminary report because we know we're just touching the tip of the iceberg here. We've got plans on how to do a deeper dive and collect information that's more specific to each clouded leopard range country. That's something we want to do more of. That's something where we could use a lot more help from folks and interns. And so the woman that's coordinating this for us is going to soon be ready to sort of help to have us take on a few interns so that we can pursue some of these things in greater detail. And that'll include doing more internet research, for example. It includes also conversations we've had about seeing what we can find on the dark web, for example, something I have no experience in doing at all, but she does some work with the Navy, and so she's got some friends in high places that are pretty cutting edge, and apparently they know how to do all that stuff. So I'm just worried about what we're going to find there. And so, but if it's there, we need to know, and it's important that we know as soon as possible. Project Neofelis is also an umbrella program for many cats that share the range of the species. Many of these cats are not in captivity anywhere. Golden cats, marbled cats, for example, Sunda marbled cats. Here's a picture of one from Borneo that is better than anyone I've ever gotten. I think that's from a colleague. The one up top is ours through a student of ours who works in Sumatra. That's of an Asiatic golden cat. Bornean bay cats and flat-headed cats are IUCN listed endangered. We don't know anything hardly about these cats. They're found, Bornean bay cats are endemic only to Borneo. Maybe there's 40 or 50 at this point pictures or records of them, and nowhere do they actually seem to be common. One area in northeastern Borneo, there seems to be more camera trap detections. A colleague of mine has gotten some of those detections there. But other than that, we just don't know anything about them. And so we're starting to invest more in these species. Flat-headed cats, we may have actually discovered a new population on Peninsula Malaysia. That's something that's going to require a little bit more legwork. And the leopard cat is very interesting because it's very widely distributed. It's very common in a lot of areas, but there are lots of populations that are geographically isolated and thus genetically distinct. So those subspecies are often threatened or endangered. And in one of those places actually is Taiwan, where we're looking to do the clouded leopard reintroduction in the future. There's a population of Taiwanese leopard cats there that's probably less than about 500 or so. So we're working right now to do a census of them. We have some ideas as to how to improve their conservation status moving forward. I cannot take credit for this photo either. This one, I've cherry-picked some really good photos that are out there. Flat-headed cats, all of our photos are horrible. And they are horrible. They're blurry, they're black and white. They're good data in the sense that we know flat-headed cats were there. But I had a colleague basically send me this because talk about an odd little cat, right? And so here's what we think we know about flat-headed cats is that they're tied to wetlands. Do you remember earlier I talked about that peat swamp forest? That's probably important habitat, for example, for species like flat-headed cats. And their populations appear to be discontinuous as well. So again, an IUCN endangered species that we're looking to address the conservation status of under Project Neofelis. Our Cameras for Conservation program, this is one I'm particularly proud of. This is an effort to sort of reach out to even the hunting community, which we feel like has been disengaged from modern conservation efforts and alienated to some extent. We found that the majority of people who purchase those cameras are not biologists. They're hunters. Hunters make up about 96% of the market of the same tools that we need and we use. And we found that many of them have disposable income, just like you and I. When we get the new phone, the new iPhone, the new whatever, what happens to the older one? Does it sit in a drawer? Some of you might know to recycle it because you've been exposed to that. But for some of these cameras, they're just sitting in closets. They're sitting in garages. And so we've reached out to hunters to try to get them to donate cameras. We've had folks and facilities do camera drives for us. So this is really exciting because we get to put these cameras then right in the hands of professionals and biologists native to Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and other range countries as well. So it's very exciting. And then this is some of the ways that some facilities, zoos, and other folks have actually helped us. The Columbus Zoo, for example, has done a Climbing for Clouds event for us. They're doing another one this year. We just had the Nashville Zoo sign on. And this is kind of an idea where if you've got a local rock climbing gym, engaging them, getting them to sort of sponsor us for a particular day. One of the days they chose was August 4th because it happens to be International Clouded Leopard Day, but not everybody can do it then. So we leave it up to some of those facilities to figure out. Some of them have like quarters for conservation programs. One of our sponsors actually was able to generate about $500 a month just by collecting recycling. That's pretty cool. Our Cameras for Conservation program. This is really interesting because we want to be able to sort of tap into those communities that have hunters in them and say, you know, we're looking for that additional support. If you've got camera traps that are going unused, can we please have them? We would love to get them into the hands of people who actually need them. People who are good with website development, we're interested in developing more programming locally and in local languages as well. Even working with teachers in the near future, particularly in those rural areas around Klong Sang, which is the sanctuary that I was talking about in Thailand, for example. We're hoping to do more work with schools and classrooms there. Graphic design, we've got this really interesting idea for doing a set of infographics. And then the helping with trafficking research, like I was talking about before. Now that we've got a lot more of a solid plan as to where we want to go with all of that next, we're going to need more folks that can do deep dives in those various areas. And then what's going to happen real soon is we're going to be able to hopefully be able to support folks in the field, and then of course corporate sponsors. This was the flyer that the Columbus Zoo circulated for us last year. Again, they've got another one coming up. You can kind of see at the Rock Gym they had this Climbing for Clouds event, and they donated the proceeds of that whole day to Project Neofelis. So very excited about that. And with that, that is the story I was hoping to tell. And I'll take some questions from you guys.
What you're doing is great, conservation-wise, yet you didn't seem too upset about them shipping a leopard to the National Zoo for a life in prison. So what are your thoughts on that?
I believe my thoughts on that are zoos inspired me. I grew up in New York. I don't know if I'd be doing what I'm doing today without the Bronx Zoo, for example.
Really?
Yeah. I believe we've gotten a lot of support from the zoo community, and we see the investment that they make in conservation around the world, in the outreach that they do. So I'm a proponent because my goal, my number one goal, the thing that motivates me, the thing that upset me was as a teenager, was extinction. That is what keeps me up at night. That's the dragon I'm interested in fighting and slaying. And I think we just need a lot of folks in that fight. We know that some zoos are a lot better than others as well. But as a kid who is from New York, grew up in Brooklyn, didn't have the Rocky Mountains in my backyard or tropical rainforests, engaging those scientists at the Bronx Zoo and the Wildlife Conservation Society, because of them, I did some of my first field work in Thailand.
I'm from New York. I'm very well aware of the Bronx Zoo, and I'm just really surprised that you feel that way because they belong in the wild. They don't belong in our country. So now they're living in a zoo. They're going to be bred, and I don't see how that is conservation for a wild animal.
Well, let me interject that for our audience here, Anthony, that within the field of caring about these animals and conservation work, there are a lot of people doing a lot of good work, and we don't all agree. We can respectfully disagree about some things.
Sure.
And so we don't believe. Now, I would say you are an outlier, a unique case where a zoo motivated you. Our feeling is that sticking an animal in a cage, even if it's a relatively large cage at a zoo where they're going to get good food and veterinary care, is inappropriate, and that the idea that an animal, gawking at an animal in a zoo, particularly a big cat, is going to educate people and make them more interested in conservation, to us, that's nonsense. And I'm not arguing with you. You're entitled to your view, and you have a personal experience that your view comes from. I just want to make sure our audience here knows that that is not something we would support, and we also have a very negative view of the Columbus Zoo, who we believe is the most regressive instead of progressive zoos among the zoo community, and that Jack Hanna is a moron and is taking these cubs onto television shows for years, which is primarily not for conservation, but to promote his own fame and career, has a negative effect because we consistently see people saying, as a result of that, I want one, as opposed to caring. And there are studies, not with big cats, but with chimps, that have shown that showing a person with the animal actually reduces the interest in
Absolutely. So this is...
Just to be clear for our people.
Okay, so this is a complex topic. And this is a topic where I've heard both sides. So I've got a lot of experience which suggests that among my colleagues and among people who are working on the front lines of conservation today, some of the leaders, I would suggest, people that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, that are fighting to protect these animals in the wild, many of them were exposed or had their interests in these animals from seeing them in facilities like that. I know a young woman, for example, who has worked for us to benefit some of our work, and I had met her at a completely different event, and we got to talking one time, and she's like, I was already on this track because of my exposure to the zoo community. I've heard lots of stories like this. What you said, though, is really important, and this is something that I think is an issue of its own, because we're dealing with this among some of the communities that we work with in Mexico. Showing people with these animals does create that problem. I agree that actually happens. One of the challenges I've run into is wanting to just talk the science of it and then show people the pictures, etc., and then hearing, oh, they're cute, I want one. And my first response is, no, but you really don't. And I don't know yet what the solution actually is, because there are folks for which this is not an issue. And so they swim in the gray, meaning even among folks that are biologists, they'll take a photo that I don't think is appropriate. I know someone, for example, who is a jaguar biologist, but has these videos of him hugging a jaguar and the jaguar on, and this is a semi-captive animal, and it promotes, not only is it potentially a dangerous message, but it promotes, it's not promoting ecology, the wild nature. It's not promoting that need to say, it's important that we respect this as it is. We respect nature as it is. We respect the evolutionary processes that led to all of these wonderful species. And so I don't necessarily know what the answer is. I will tell you this. I do think about it a lot. It's not something I think it's a small issue, especially with the rise of social media and the way this messaging moves around so quickly without any context.
Well, I think we've spent a good amount of time on it, and there are different views. I will say to you that what we think the solution is the kind of work that we're doing with virtual reality, where people can get a vivid experience with the animal without the animal present, and that will eventually be, not eventually, but within a few years, develop into the substitute for having the animals in a cage. Let me ask you about something that's much less controversial.
I do want to say to that, though, one of the other hats I wear is in the conservation technology and innovation arena. This is something we're talking about for other things, including to give somebody that field biologist experience of being in a rainforest. And so I'm really interested in seeing where all of that actually goes. So I'd love to circle back with you on that in the future.
You've described doing projects across multiple species, even as we talked about the cloud leopard, across multiple countries. And I'm curious, is all this work being done simultaneously? And regardless of how much of it simultaneously, what does your organization look like from a staffing standpoint? I'm sitting here thinking, my God, how are you managing to run
Great question.
of projects, and what kind of a budget actually does it take to do that?
So I've gotten really good at sort of leveraging relationships and partnerships. Not all of our partnerships. Sometimes it's really interesting how we work on things. And what I noticed that was when I stopped becoming concerned about what a project needs to have to be called a project or a program, I realized that many things were possible. And so sometimes what we'll do is, as in the case of our Jaguar project in South America, we'll start a project from scratch. We'll build it from the ground up. We've done that with other projects as well. Sometimes we develop an overarching program which will include things that we start up from scratch. And in Project Neofelis, some of that is revolved around our clouded leopard work in Borneo, for example. But we'll also start to bring in partners. Some of those partners can then go on to become staff, but while I work with them as partners, I'm not necessarily responsible for staffing them or paying them. What I will do is work with them to develop something that's a little bit more sustainable. And so over time, sometimes those partners then become staff. And so I don't work with anybody unless I have the sense that I don't have to really be micromanaging and looking over everybody's shoulders. And so long as we have regular meetings about timelines and what objectives are to be met by when. So I'm very excited because we've got a really dynamic bunch of folks that we're working with right now.
How many of them would actually be staff, would be employees of your organization?
Probably about a dozen or so.
And they're scattered around the world?
They are, yeah. And then beyond that, temporary staff, meaning like a particular project period, volunteers, interns, students, and the occasional part-time, a few part-time staff. When you add all of them together, there's probably about between 40 and 50 people.
And how much money do you have to raise each year to keep this going?
A lot.
You're a nonprofit, right?
We are a non-profit organization. Yeah.
So that information is public. So
Yeah.
what is your annual budget?
This year, I think we're going to probably hit $500,000, $600,000, more or less. A lot of the times, what we'll do is because we have really strong partners. If we work and write grants together, we're not always the one that accepts the money. So a project has money, and a lot of the times it's just easier to divert it to a partner. So even if I go and spearhead, pull this whole thing together, write the grant, and actually in many ways that was the model that we adopted early and got us to get us started. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Took some badgering, but it
You talked about introducing the clouded leopard into an area that it's no longer found in.
Yeah.
So where would those clouded leopards come from that you would introduce?
That's a good question. So there is talk of working with this facility in Thailand. Because this isn't going to happen tomorrow, I envision this to be a pretty long, drawn-out process over about 5 to 10 years. And what I'm hoping to do is that we can do more genetic analysis as well to be able to identify possible source populations better than what we actually know now. For example, I've got a hypothesis, for example, that some populations in southern China are probably best suited for reintroducing to Taiwan. That's going to require a very strong partnership with China and Chinese facilities there and Chinese biologists on the ground. The good news is that as we enter this phase and move to the next steps, we still have a lot of time to figure that out, but I suspect it's going to be one of those two. Yeah.
Carrying on with what she said, I presume when you say this, you're talking about taking cats from a different wild population and moving them across. Like a lot of the problems we have here, a lot of the cats we've had, with especially a lot of time with our rehab bobcats, we can't re-release them because they're too used to people or they've been born in captivity and they wouldn't know how to cope with the wild.
Right. If we were to go, so I think the answer would be the same. If we were to reintroduce, or rather, if we're talking about a wild population, we're calling it translocation. So if we were to do that, or even if we were to use captive individuals, the idea would be to have a generation or so that is not exposed to people. One organization that we are working with in South America is the Tompkins Conservation Trust. And so what they're doing is trying to reintroduce jaguars to Ibarra National Park in northern Argentina. And one of the reasons we're really interested in that is because we work in Paraguay, and we just think it's a matter of time before any jaguar that's released in the landscape in Argentina just shows up in Paraguay. And the reason is a jaguar is a jaguar. It's just going to go wherever it wants. You're going to think it's got all the food that it needs here. You're going to read all the literature and say this is enough biomass of prey to support the jaguar. And then 3 weeks into the release, the jaguar is just going to go, I'm going to go over here. And it's inevitable. And what I'm worried about is without coordinating across boundaries, and so I'm really interested in transboundary relationships and partnerships and things, because you have to get cut through the complicated politics of it all. But one of the things that they're doing is just that. They're developing a generation of jaguars with an enclosure where they don't ever really see people. And so I think some of those releases are coming in the next 2 years.
What is the people at Jackson Hole?
Husband
and wife team?
Christine Tompkins.
I couldn't remember the name.
Yeah, well, they started Tompkins Conservation Trust, and they're in charge of the project. Doug is no longer with us, but it's Christine's project. So our staff has met with their staff to start this conversation about what happens, because jaguars were extirpated from eastern Paraguay. We work in western Paraguay in the Chaco. We're trying to kind of hold the line for jaguars at that southernmost edge. If one just all of a sudden shows up in eastern Paraguay, it's going to get shot. And so we're going to hopefully let communities know that in the years ahead, jaguars might be coming. Yeah.
Did it take a lot for you to convince the 2 villages that you went to that it was a good idea to bring back the clouded leopards? Like, because I know you were saying that when you were there, you were able to kind of like get into like their backyards and talk to them. Was it difficult for you to kind of get them on board to have them back?
Yeah.
Or was it pretty easy?
We didn't try to pursue a clear agenda.
Okay.
We had a series of questions which we asked folks. It was really interesting because in these indigenous nations, of course, you've got chiefs at different levels. You've got the chief of a nation, and then you've got chiefs of different groups within that nation. Think about it like geographic family lineages and such. And so, and then you need to get permission from that chief before you can kind of do anything. And so what we noticed too when we were talking, we wanted a broad diversity of opinions. Mm-hmm. And so when we started talking to the young women, we were referred by them to the chief. Mm-hmm. And we had to cut through all that because we saw what was going on there, right? We saw this thought like, well, we don't know about clouded leopards, and what you really want to do is talk to the chief, and maybe there wasn't really an approved permission to really talk on this topic. And so we cut through all that, and that was great because we got to actually talk to women across generations about how they felt as well. And so what we did was we just asked questions about clouded leopards, how they felt about clouded leopards, what they knew about clouded leopards, and then in the end really added all that up, like what that actually meant. So, and what I'm hoping is all of that information gives us the basis for the next step. What do we do next? So addressing some of these concerns, for example, over things like hunting and what that would mean for their hunting, that would be a logical next consideration.
I was wondering, as far as you're saying and starting to investigate as to the pet trades portions of it.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they're coming from some type of breeding farm that we're not really seeing at all. Are we testing any of the ones that have been caught as to inbreeding and what might be going with that?
So, can you clarify the first part of the question?
In other words, the pet trade seems to be something kind of new to what you're investigating.
Okay, yeah. So I think I understand what you're saying. So I don't think there's an underground black market. I think a lot of the pet trade that we're seeing is incidentally related to hunting. Cubs, for example, that are brought into captivity when parents are killed. I'll just back up and say I don't have any evidence that there's any kind of breeding going on. We might find that that's true. So we just kind of need to get there. It's interesting when these animals for sale kind of pop up, they pop up on Facebook and social media, and then they're gone. Like instantly they're gone. So they must be communicating, or there must be people in the know that see those things and then know more or less what to do. So we've had to even take screenshots when we see it, because you go back a couple days later or next week, it's all gone. So so this is kind of what we're trying. And so some of the next steps, and so where I think interns can also help, is we're going to try to do deeper dives with each of the individual countries and the authorities in those countries to see what we can learn about what all this is and how it's all happening.
Are you able to at least inspect some of those animals that they've retrieved? Or
I haven't yet seen or inspected any live animals, but have inspected confiscated skins and parts, and on a few occasions, whole animals that had been killed. I haven't seen any of the live ones yet. And I think we're seeing this on social media, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of live animals being confiscated. There were a few, which suggests to me that there's a lot more of this happening than folks are able to stop. So I'd like to get to the bottom of all that and find out what's happening. Yeah.
The facility you visited where you touched the clouded leopard,
Yeah.
was that like rehab? I mean, how did those clouded leopards get there?
So those are animals that were born in captivity that were going to then go on to be ambassador animals.
Okay, so they were like breeding them to send to zoos.
Yes, that is correct. And that could be a partner facility with respect to Taiwan. One of the things we're going to learn by working with that facility is the type of facilities we might be able to establish in Taiwan. And this would be, of course, for their eventual reintroduction. So that's what I'm hoping that we get out of this. And so we're hopefully going to have a meeting later this year and be able to start talking about that process, the budget, permission, and meetings with indigenous leaders to see where such a facility might actually occur.
I have a question about Taiwan. Two questions. How long has it been since they've known that clouded leopard has lived there, and like what's that time period? And then what other carnivores would the clouded leopard be competing with in that area? Do you already know that?
Yeah, they would be the top carnivore. So there are no leopards, there are no tigers, there are smaller carnivores. There's the Taiwanese leopard cat. There are civets there, but restoring clouded leopards, and this is why it would be so interesting, is restoring the top predator.
And how long
on the island?
Do they know how long it's been since they've?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a story in and of itself, and we could talk about for a very long time. The disappearance of the clouded leopard from Taiwan is a little bit of a mystery, and I think I have a hypothesis as to what could have happened, but I would caveat that it's just a theory. Depending on who you talk to, somebody's brother or uncle just saw a clouded leopard in the mountains 15 years ago. And so when a species goes extinct and starts to disappear, it becomes very challenging to separate reality from fantasy. People still think they see clouded leopards, and yet in so many places there's been so many surveys and camera traps have been put in some of the best habitats, and everything else is there, and there would be no reason why a clouded leopard wouldn't show up on camera if it was there. But I think its disappearance has something to do with the period around Japanese occupation in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the forestry practices that were implemented at that time, as well as the trade in their skins. It was interesting to see some artifacts, for example, in Japan, like sword scabbards for things like katanas that were made of clouded leopard skins. So it's me more or less trying to put together this theory. And the other thing is, by poor forestry practices, a lot of the low elevation forest had either been removed, cleared, or converted for agriculture at one point or another, and that's the surest way to start getting rid of clouded leopards, especially if on top of that there was maybe demand for their skins. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have two questions. One is about how many do you think are left in the wild? And the other one is, why do you think that there's been such a lack of research done? Are they just so elusive, or?
Good questions. First thing a scientist will tell you is or likes to tell you is they like to talk about uncertainty in terms of numbers. I know from talking with folks like you and from talking to the public that everybody wants a number. And the truth is, for clouded leopards, even more so than some of the other species, we really don't know. And that's just because there haven't been a lot of good studies in order to even extrapolate many of these numbers that we do here. By the way, with the exception of maybe certain species like tigers, which have now been very much restricted to certain protected areas that are heavily quantified year after year. that's why I feel much better about those numbers. On the opposite end of the spectrum, there's very little. And so some of the work that we're doing in Thailand, for example, is in part an attempt to address that. By doing a longer term monitoring project, we can see maybe how a population might change through time, and then we could make better informed inferences as to what might be happening with other populations as well. So I'm not trying to dodge your question,
That's not the answer I was expecting.
but it's tough. Like, for example, in one of our studies with Sunda clouded leopards, where we did the first estimate of population size there, we were finding about four animals per 100 square kilometers, which is roughly in line with what you would find for other big cats, even tiger densities, which is interesting because in Borneo, the clouded leopard is the top predator unless you want to factor in sun bears. I've often thought about what would happen if a sun bear and a clouded leopard would meet. Sun bears happen to also be the smartest bear in the world, so that would be an interesting. And as to your other question, elusive, why haven't they been studied? This is a tough one. I would offer a couple of answers. Number one, maybe more than any other cat, they are the rainforest cat, and those are very challenging environments to work in. So beyond using cameras, for example, or anything else such as like radio collaring, which is going to potentially give us a lot more valuable data like we've got for other species, the technology just doesn't work well in rainforests. And so that is something I am working hard to try to figure out in terms of my interests in conservation technology. And the second is just the division in terms of how they use those habitats, the ground versus how they use the canopy. We don't know a lot about that, and so more questions need to be focused on that. So as you saw in the presentation, there's a lot of interesting things on the horizon, so I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get to some of those questions soon.
I think we'll do Fran. No, we good?
Yeah, we go.
Okay.
Actually, I got two questions here on Facebook. So one is easy, do they use corridors? And the other is probably more difficult. Can you make the sound of a clouded leopard?
Oh, I cannot make the. Do they use corridors? Yes, and here's the thing. This is really what we're after, and some of our questions relate to them using corridors. That area where we work in Borneo, for example, we're trying to incentivize communities, remember, to use this area. And so we know if an area is large enough, any large carnivore is going to use it. But because this connection really isn't built, we'll get to see it maybe as it happens. We know, for example, that in this forest, leopard cats have moved through there. The community has used cameras in this corridor, but no clouded leopards have moved through there yet, and no sun bears have moved there. So what are the next steps? What are the things that we can make it? How can we make it more suitable? So the answer is yes, the right corridor, clouded leopards will use it. I don't think I could even try to make the sound of a clouded leopard. I've heard them chirp in much the same way that you'll hear a puma chirp. I've heard them chuff because they're big cats, remember?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So, no, not in the way a domestic cat or a mountain lion will purr. I've heard them make other sounds that I wouldn't quite know how to characterize, but I've heard them do a chirp which is very reminiscent of a puma or a cheetah, for example. Yeah, I think that's another area of research that I'd be interested in, because it's very possible that they have other complex vocalizations, right? And I know if I picked up the phone and called Bill, we could probably talk about that all day, and he's like, well, they make this kind of sound and that kind of sound, because who knows, that could be, knowledge about that could be an important survey tool for us in the future if we want it to be. All right, thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.